Next, we gain new insights into the tools available to make compliance easier and the workflows that enable those efforts during Robert Schwendinger's CIO at Arcfield session. Bob was named CIO of Arcfield in November of 2021. He was charged with standing up the new organization's enterprise IT. Within a year, Schwendinger and his team established a greenfield 2020-era IT infrastructure focused on establishing a true edge-to-cloud environment while meeting all core CMMC levels of compliance. The team also leveraged emerging technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence to enhance the end-user experience. Bob's innovative approach to enterprise IT will allow the company now to grow organically and inorganically while scaling its IT environment accordingly and maintaining a superior level of support to their customers' most critical national security missions. Thank you for joining us today, Bob.
Appreciate that wonderful introduction. And Bob, thanks so much for joining us here at CMMC CON 2023. You have a long history.
Eric, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled. And partly, one of the things I want to start with is you have a long history in the aerospace and defense industry as a truly innovative thinker, and someone who's really relentlessly in pursuit, I think, of a better way of doing things. And you've lived through many business evolutions, right, in technology over the last 20 years, cloud computing, mobile computing, remote work, and more. So actually, I'd just love to start by hearing about your priorities. What are you working on today?
Sure. And just to get the story straight, I'm actually 21 still, so 20 years is irrelevant here. Yeah, so in general, some of the key areas for me, obviously, is data. I think data is a huge opportunity, provide a competitive edge to our company, and take advantage of it in a multitude of different areas. One of what my other key areas is really a live CMDB, and with a live CMDB, utilizing some of the data, obviously, that we're pulling through. We're able to take that from sources of truth, give an example like Intune and other IT management level systems, and ultimately utilize that to map out the environment in a real-time sense, so that in a circumstance where we want to make a change on a router or we want to make an up, say 0365, we know exactly who it's impacting, when it's impacting them, what part of the business they're a part of, and ultimately if it's going to impact any type of proposal work or anything else.
That's super interesting because you mentioned CMDB. There was very recently actually an article in the Wall Street Journal around kind of data being the new currency. And one of the kind of age-old problems in cybersecurity is if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. And so to hear you say that you're focusing on kind of understanding your assets and not just relying on the scans, that kind of what typically happens, and I'd love to hear you kind of a layman's explanation of CMDB. What typically happens, I think, is that scans from different tools are all hobbled together and you get very messy, dirty, incomplete data. Sounds like you're trying to solve that problem.
Yeah, I mean, if I go back to the data aspect of things, I mean, the key thing, obviously, and I think most people understand this already, is understanding your data, right? Taking advantage of it, really pulling in some of the newer tools that are out there. I mean, machine learning has been out there for a bit, and obviously we've been using that and doing continuous updates. But the abilities that a lot of the cloud providers provide, a lot of the things that you can do even within your own environment with that, it allows you to take advantage of those elements, do some cross correlations, pull in the right resources that understand the other aspects of the data. And you can do things not only just within an IT environment, but you name it, within the business. I mean, again, going back to that competitive edge that you get. And I know that there's companies out there driving on this, because clearly that, you see companies starting up and spinning in this area, because it is a really big advantage. The CMD aspect of things, allowing you to see what my system is connected to, understanding the applications that are deployed, understanding who's utilizing the system, when it was last updated, what is the firmware on it. All those are key areas, especially when you're looking at from a cyber aspect, primarily due to the fact that you want to ensure that the system is not vulnerable for attack, right? You want to ensure that if somebody does spearfish the individual, that the data or the system that is compromised is not taking advantage of the entire environment, right? So ensuring that those connection points are accurate, making sure that obviously all those elements of communications are functional. And a lot of that data provides that. And then again, going back to the real time, it gives you that real time aspect of things. So it's not one or two or a week old, days old. It's really real there. So you can see down to the second. And from a historical perspective, you can actually see if something occurred. You can go back and see what was the position of your environment at that point in time. And that's a huge advantage. And that's where I look at live CMDB as a major element to ensuring that you have a clean operations, obviously the cyber resilience, and really just understanding your environment better than your adversaries might.
So what I think is so interesting about that, so as a former CISO, hearing a CIO talk about CMDB from a enabling the business perspective, there's such a beautiful overlap between all the objectives of a security organization, because if you don't have a CMDB in a security organization, you're at an enormous, a clean one, an effective one, disadvantage. And so to hear you kind of tie those things together, both from a business utility perspective and a security perspective, I think is music to a lot of people's ears. You mentioned cloud computing. Obviously, it's transformed how businesses operate, cost efficiency, scalability, flexibility, list goes on. But I believe within the defense industrial base, there was, I don't know if it's still there as much, historically, a little bit of resistance from kind of the security side of the house, right? Around data sovereignty concerns, putting data in the cloud. How do you think about balancing those security concerns against the clear business benefits and need to drive the business forward when it comes to the cloud?
From my perspective, I actually think that the key providers have already accomplished a lot of this, right? I mean, you have obviously, your GCC High from Microsoft, you have your Gov Cloud from AWS, you have the IC level elements, MAG again from Microsoft, and all those take that data sovereignty into consideration, right? And in addition to that, they also provide a level of self-encryption ability. So in other words, I can bring my own keys to the environment, encrypt the data, ensure it's really in my control and not necessarily, I get you have the SaaS and the PaaS and the IaaS capabilities within those environments, but at the same time, I'm actually in control of my data from the aspect of who has access to it and ensuring that it is secured from the element of even within those environments and only given to the individuals that need access.
Yeah, really. So I think what I hear there is security's foundational. It's very much built into a lot of those cloud providers' operating models. So it's kind of in flight in terms of being solved by the providers, and it's foundational to everything that's being done in the cloud. So no need to fear the cloud, right? I mean, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there's always circumstances, right? Hybrid. Even in some cases on-prem where necessary, right? Whether it's contractual or it's an element of, continuous compute and you can see certain things. I mean, the ability though to spin up fast, the ability to do infrastructure as code, a lot of those opportunities especially get easily exposed and more capable of being able to utilize in a rapid sense, I guess, when you're especially utilizing the cloud, which is a huge benefit. And especially when you look at, do you build or do you build, on-prem and assist and sustain that environment, which takes a lot of operational costs, or do you go within the clouds, especially the ones that are provided today? There are a lot of benefits, right?
Yeah, and I think just the awareness that and the practicality in your answer of like, look, there's going to be circumstances where you have to be on-prem or hybrid or others. And so just being practical in the approach. And I think practicality is something that going back to the security and compliance theme, taking a practical approach relative to security. Most of your career, you've been in IT leadership roles and you've worked in collaboration with security, but not embedded within the security organization. I think that's really interesting because, across our customer base here at Cybersheath, and I'm sure in the audience, the reporting structures around security and IT, I mean, they're different all over the place. And I think you have an amazing track record, truly, as being a strong partner and collaborator with security, despite much of your career not necessarily being formally in the security chain of command from a reporting relationship. How have you done that? What's the secret to a successful partnership between IT and security?
So in my view, actually, cybersecurity should be the top of every IT individual's mind. I mean, you cannot stand up IT without taking that into consideration. And I think in the early days, was there a lot of issues as far as where security would put some type of tool on it and it would sort of hinder the environment? I think we're past all that, right? I think especially in this day and age, that is an absolute criteria when you take a look at whether you're going with a SaaS offering or you're deploying something within the cloud or even on premise. All those elements should be taken into consideration, and it should be as part of your part of your architecture in general. So, taking cybersecurity into consideration as part of your architecture is big, right? Ultimately always working with your colleagues and partnering with them is also a major thing, because what you want to ensure that you have the necessary mitigations in place for cyber and data loss in general, so that the business meets all their requirements and even exceeds them in some cases, especially with some of the opportunities that come out of it, because all that cyber data, all that backup data, and the redundancy information that you have, digital twin capabilities, you can pull from that and utilize that to your advantage, whether it's, like I mentioned before, the CMDB, or the ability to see where you can take advantage of compute at certain times or shut down compute at certain times, ultimately to keep your costs down. I can continue to go here from that aspect, but again, cyber is a major part of that, right? It does allow you to decide how to architect it appropriately. And again,
Yeah, I think that's amazing, because really that partnership, I mean, there's obviously some kind of intangibles there about kind of, just being a good partner, but then when it gets down to the nitty-gritty reality, I think what's amazing is how the shift between, I think there used to be obviously probably a correct focus on availability kind of in the CIO world maybe 10 years ago, and availability was kind of king. And now there's been a shift where every CIO I talk to, it starts with security. And I think that mirrors what we hear from the federal government. Security is foundational. And I think that it's a wonderful shift for this country to know we have such alignment. I mean, we hear a lot of negative things about kind of where we are relative to cybersecurity, but I would say there's a tremendous amount of positive alignment in the public-private partnership between DoD, the intelligence community, and others, and industry. And I just heard it very much in your answer. Among the efforts to kind of improve cybersecurity is CMMC, which is why pretty much all of the audience is here today, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. I think when people hear CMMC, they think cybersecurity, rightly so, it's built into the acronym, but actually the vast majority of CMMC requirements tend to be delivered by the IT side of most organizations. So I always joke that security kind of sometimes we're the heroes, right? We get to run into the burning building, save the baby. But the hard things, like putting out the fire and cleaning up, are done by IT. And so the actual patching of vulnerabilities, asset management, you mentioned CMDB, configuring Azure Active Directory and Intune controls. These things are all typically responsibilities of the IT team. Can you give us an example of how your team in the CIO shop delivers compliance with these security requirements like CMMC, and then kind of reports progress with security and other stakeholders?
In general, the logging, the monitoring, the controls around accounts, the elements of key security tools in place to ensure that, obviously the patching and everything is occurring. I mean, those are all accuracies. Some of the stuff that we do is ultimately, as we're building out our environment and our infrastructure, we build it with infrastructure as code in our organization, right? And what that gives you is that advantage to make sure that as that code is deployed and the systems are operational, so you have your infrastructure stood up or you have your SaaS-based offerings integrated into the environment, what you do see is you see clearly where there is a configuration change. So one of the things we do is we continuously monitor the configuration changes. And when we see a delta that's not aligned with a change approval or an that occurs within the environment that we're not expecting, we do raise those. We raise those immediately so that we can take a look at them. And meanwhile, we have the ability to back them out. And literally by a click of a button, reverse the actual configuration that was changed, put it back to what it was without any implications outside of the fact knowing that somebody made a change, whether it was unapproved change or some other element that might have affected it.
It's amazing of how far really we've come, and how blurry that line I think will always be between security and IT. I think, a decade ago it was, this is security, this is IT, this has been my job jar, this is in yours. It's just, there's such a blend there that the partnership that you talked about earlier is clearly just critical. It's mission critical, actually. In speaking of kind of that partnership and how you deliver on your objectives as a CIO, obviously the board, I'm sure, has a great interest in everything you're doing. I mean, today, most businesses can't function without their IT infrastructure and leadership team. And so, as CIO, how do you choose the topics that you select for discussion with your board? Is that an area where you and the CISO work together to have alignment, or how does that work?
I mean, in general, we have our swim lanes, especially when we're presenting to the board. So from an IT side, it's always more from a perspective of statistics around the organizational growth and the data we analyze. It's, meeting SLAs, budget numbers, upcoming major changes in the environment that improve the business or might impact the business in general. Those are the areas that we're in. Obviously, in the CISO side, it's more levels of where we are potentially vulnerable or where we are making sure that we're keeping adversaries at bay, and those key elements. Ensuring that everybody's up to par in training. Those are key areas from a CISO perspective, and probably a lot more because I am obviously not a CISO. They do have other elements that they do report on depending on the circumstances.
But I think what's so clear there is just kind of the maturity around kind of engagement, obviously, at the board level, which obviously that kind of engagement drives resourcing, drives opportunities for improvement, and drives kind of a continually maturing organization. So you having that seat at the table, I think, is serves your organization obviously very well. Going back to resources for a second, and thinking through, because one of the complaints we hear a lot about CMMC, the two things really, if you, particularly with industry groups, is you'll hear it's too hard and it's too expensive. And so that to me said, okay, how are we planning to meet these requirements? And so I'd love to just a little insight on how you plan and manage your IT budget to balance operational needs, innovation, and then inherently things that are security related, but your responsibility to deliver. Like, how do you think about that?
So from an operational aspect of IT, I mean, that's a consistent, it's a year after year consistency to a degree, right? So you always know roughly the tools that are in place that you're utilizing outside of the refresh of them, the personnel that are required, all those elements, and they come to a sort of a sustained configuration that you should expect. And those costs tend to sort of, I don't want to say flatten, but they tend to stay consistent year after year. The innovative side of it, it's more about, pushing for business opportunities, right? Or pushing for gain to the business is the way I look at it, at least. Data lake, I'm sure that's been out for a bit, but I mean, give a good example of that is investing in a data lake is huge. All right, it's an opportunity that should be taken advantage of. And, when you go into these budget meetings and review and try to push for the next year's budget, bringing these innovative ideas up, and showing how it ties into the architecture as well as provides to the business is a big push to making sure that those dollars are in there to take advantage of and ultimately go to the next level. Again, going back to, I look at it from an IT, I'm providing a service to the business to ensure that they are always giving the best service to the customer and they're staying ahead of the competition, right? Those are the big ones for me, at least.
Yeah, I think that is just absolute wisdom for our audience here today, is because I think one of the things that the most successful CIOs, CISOs, or leaders in general of any function that supports the business, the trait that I see most common among them is that they're focused on enabling the business, not kind of IT for IT's sake, security for security's sake. So, I mean, just the way you framed that up, everything in there was about enabling the business, finding ways for the business to be more competitive, to win. I think that's just amazing wisdom for kind of any aspiring CIO, CISO in our audience today. The other thing on the innovation theme, and you mentioned a couple of these earlier, so I'm not sure if you have anything else to add on it, but what emerging technology trends do you believe will most significantly impact our industry, the aerospace and defense industry, in the next few years, and how should we prepare for them?
I mean, obviously, any level of AI coming in, whether it's a GPT or ML, and the expansion, there's opportunities to take advantage of those, even in ensuring that again the data is sovereign, right? So making sure that you have the content of your data being reviewed within your control, right? That's a big thing there. I mean, the other aspect of it, the decentralized internet from a Web3 perspective, I think is absolutely coming. So I think there's opportunities there, especially as you identify services out on the internet and utilize those services. And then I think I mentioned it before, internet is infrastructure as code is huge. I think that'll continue to expand, right? I mean, we do it through a majority of our environment today, but to the point where you can almost cookie cutter the environment and deploy the entire environment in just a matter of a push of a button is big. So whether it's a DR event or anything else, you can have the infrastructure completely up and operational again. And or if you're spinning out a new office, you can spin that up with a matter of a push of a button. So no longer are you waiting the 3 to 6 months for that office to be operational from an IT perspective and connection, et cetera.
What I always love about talking with you, Bob, is like, sometimes some of the concepts that you articulate, maybe our audience has read about them in Gartner or Forrester or some kind of white paper, and that's interesting, but I always kind of look at that stuff of like, great, how do you actually do it? What I love that comes across is like, no, this is the how. So the what is interesting, but the idea of someone who's actually put so many of these things in practice, it's pretty motivating. So I love this discussion, and I want to take it back to cybersecurity a little bit for a second here, because in previous roles, I know you've literally been at the very tip of the spear in responding to major cyber attacks in your past, and leading IT teams through enormous remediation efforts relative to threats. I mean, at the scale that I think few people have. And so much of the remediation, in my experience, ends up as the responsibility of IT to execute, as I alluded to before. So I'd love to hear some of the lessons learned from those experiences that our audience may be able to gain some wisdom from.
I mean, right off the bat, for me, it's ensuring that you have your data, copies of it in three places. So backups really times 3, right? Just in general, obviously with all the testing, everything else that goes along with it. I think that is a major element, especially as you see adversaries coming in and attacking that data and taking advantage of it in other elements. MFA, so multi-factor authentication, is a no-brainer that clearly has to be deployed across enterprises today. Just-in-time level access is another one. So ensuring that access isn't always there, right? Those are big ones. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but zero trust to me is really the foundation of the infrastructure in some ways this day and age. So if your environment's not doing zero trust, I'd argue that that's something that you need to clearly look at. And obviously there's some different organizations that offer zero trust, but that is expanding, especially even within the cloud providers now. Oh, and lots of coffee, especially when you're going through one of those. That's a key thing.
That's right. Coffee and food for sure. That's right.
Yeah.
You touched on resiliency, actually, which was one of the topics I wanted to cover with you. There's been a big shift actually between what we used to call just BCDR, business continuity, disaster recovery, has become a major focus of, really the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has done a lot to try and shift the focus from just stopping cyber attacks, which you can't always do, to being resilient in a world where those attacks are inevitable. So again, so much of resiliency in both architecture, which you touched on, and infrastructure, and the execution of the plan when bad things happen, falls to the CIO and his team. So any more insights? You mentioned backups around how you think about building resiliency into your architecture and infrastructure, because when kind of when the rubber meets the road, it's IT, I think, again, that has a lot of responsibility for the resiliency.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, right, the numerous backups is key. Infrastructure as code is a big element of that, and really cross cloud, I think, is also, because in general, tying yourself to a single cloud provider, I think is great in some ways, but also the ability to ensure that you have that level of cross-cloud configuration so that in the circumstance where something is attacked, let's say from a cloud provider, you have the ability to still operate. And with all those in mind, you can take the environment, you can burn it down and bring it back up relatively easily, ensuring that you have a continued operations with minimal impact. So those are the big ones, at least for me.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, because when when you're kind of on the front lines and you're going through one of those cyber attacks, to know that you've got that resiliency built into the organization, I mean, is a huge safety net. And actually today it's table stakes. You have to have it. You've been super generous with your time, Bob. So I want to give you one more question as we wrap this up. And I just wanted to see if we could get you to describe a time when you had to convince stakeholders to adopt a new technology, a new IT strategy, and what your approach was and what were the outcomes. Because I think that, again, taking it back to the audience here today, CMMC, well, it's been around for really 15 years, just by different names. It's new for many people. It's new for most CFOs as they look to fund it in budgets. It's new for CIOs as they figure how to divert resources. So, it comes up all the time. So I think your answer to that would be helpful to the audience today. So again, a time when you had to convince stakeholders to adopt a new technology or IT strategy. What was the approach? What were the outcomes?
Sure. So in general, here at Arcfield, Kevin, our CEO, gave me the opportunity to present, the IT vision. Right. I was able to lay out the architecture. I was to ensure that CMMC level cybersecurity there, provide an environment that ultimately offered an end user friendly experience, and also, like I mentioned before, giving the business the necessary tools to produce a solid solution for product for their customers. And in our sense, it's really what the goal is here is to support the customer's mission, right? To ensure that all these elements sort of tie in together and make sure that they provide that level of opportunity for the customer. But in doing this, I was able to convince, obviously, Kevin and the organization as a whole that this was the right approach, and ultimately putting it in place. I think they truly believe it and stand behind that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful outcome, and I think that the idea of having kind of a thought through strategy, but again, bought into by the business, right? I think one of the things
absolutely
so successful.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
yeah, that's right. This would be a different interview. No, that's I think that's so true, and it's a big change, and I think it's why you've been so successful in your career, is kind of that thinking of the business first. And it's one of the things I love about this industry is the alignment between kind of customer, the ultimate customer, the war fighter, and the companies that are serving the war fighter. And I think IT, in the way you described, kind of enabling the customer and the business, is very much aligned with that. So, Bob, again, you've been super generous with your time today. I think the audience has benefited greatly from your time and experience. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone. Thanks so much, Bob.
Eric, thank you. I appreciate your time as well and the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Bob, for that informative question and answer session discussing the challenges of innovating securely.